A trial that could shake the foundation of the criminal justice system in Illinois is set to begin soon in Chicago. 7 prosecutors and police officers are accused of fabricating the evidence that sent an innocent man named Rolando Cruz to death row for the rape and murder of a 10-year-old girl. What is most disturbing about this story is that another man, a man who actually confessed to the murder, has not been prosecuted for it and may never be. For nearly 10 years, Rolando Cruz sat on death row, counting the days until his execution. But ever since Cruz and 2 other men were first arrested in 1983 for the rape and murder of Jeanine Nicarico in the Chicago suburb of Naperville, serious doubts were raised about their guilt. There was no physical evidence or eyewitness testimony linking any of them to the crime. Even one of the lead detectives assigned to the case, John Sam, was convinced they didn't do it.
I told my bosses on numerous occasions that I did not believe these 3 men had anything whatsoever to do with this crime, that we have the wrong people. We need to go out and look at someone else.
And they said to you?
No. No more.
Don't investigate?
Don't do another thing.
Why?
Because I was making the case look bad. If I was out looking at other people, that means we weren't too convinced that they were guilty, and once they were indicted, they didn't want that out.
Rolando Cruz and the 2 other men, Alex Hernandez and Stephen Buckley, became prime suspects after Cruz and Hernandez told police they had information about the murder. Information police said only the killers could know. Later, they said they really didn't know anything. They were just trying to collect the reward money offered in the case. But a jury found Cruz and Hernandez guilty and sentenced them to death. They appealed. And based on a legal technicality, the conviction was thrown out. They were tried again, convicted again, and sent back to death row. Rolando Cruz was given a date for his execution.
I knew I didn't do anything wrong. I wasn't going to just sit there and let them execute me. I was going to do everything I could do to get out.
Now enter a world-famous mystery writer who also happens to be a lawyer, Scott Turow, whose bestsellers include Presumed Innocent and Burden of Proof. Turow decided to take on a real-life murder mystery after he was convinced that, in this case, the wrong men were sent to death row. He handled the second appeal for Alex Hernandez.
Can you imagine committing a murder of this nature and leaving behind no physical evidence of any kind, not a fingerprint, not a hair, not a fiber, no DNA? Come on. Come on.
You've written several successful novels involving murder and the criminal justice system. How does the plot in this case measure up?
This is a very sad story. This is a really, really sad story.
According to Turow, it started with political pressure to make an arrest. Pressure from voters in the affluent community where the murder victim lived. And the prosecutors responded to it, Turow says, by indicting Rolando Cruz and the 2 others just 2 weeks before a hotly contested election for the job of top prosecutor in DuPage County.
That community was up in arms, and they demanded, they demanded justice.
There was pressure on the police and prosecutors to bring someone
Absolutely.
to the system, try them, convict them, put them away.
You're going to be an ineffective law enforcement person in their eyes if you don't come up with a perpetrator.
But twice, a jury looked at this case. 2 separate juries found these guys guilty.
Are you asking me why?
That's pretty compelling evidence, isn't it?
It's not compelling evidence if you don't put the case on straight.
And the case that was made against Rolando Cruz was anything but straight, especially one highly incriminating piece of evidence which was used to convict Cruz. It was a statement Cruz allegedly made about a dream he had, which police said contained details of the crime that only the murderer could have known. The problem with this so-called dream statement is that Cruz said he never made it, and nobody has a record of it ever occurring. There's no police report, no tape recording, and the first time it was ever mentioned was a 1.5 years after he supposedly made it, and just 4 days before Cruz went on trial. Thomas Knight prosecuted Rolando Cruz in his first trial. Knight says the dream statement was just one part of the case against Rolando Cruz, and he had no reason to question its validity.
You decided to present incriminating evidence against Cruz based in part on this dream statement, and yet the police who heard it never wrote it down. They never made a report about it. They never recorded it. I mean, something doesn't sound right.
You know, people are not that perfect that they end up writing everything down.
They wrote everything else down?
Well, I don't think that's probably not even true.
My experience is that when the defendant confesses, the police always write that down. There's no conceivable reason that you would not make a record of an incredibly incriminating statement. Not in my experience as a lawyer.
But an even more incredibly incriminating statement was made when, soon after Rolando Cruz was sent to death row after his first trial, this man, Brian Dugan, a career criminal, told authorities that he was the one who killed Jeanine Nicarico. Dugan confessed to the Nicarico murder after he was arrested and confessed to 2 other murders in neighboring counties. He was sentenced to life in prison, but the new prosecutor on the case in DuPage County, Robert Colander, chose not to believe Brian Dugan killed Jeanine Nicarico. The Illinois State Police, believing that Dugan might be the real killer, assigned Detective Ed Sosowski to investigate.
Sitting here today, is there any doubt in your mind as to who raped and murdered Jeanine Nicarico?
No doubt whatsoever.
And that person is?
Brian Dugan.
What is it that brings you to that conclusion?
He knew information that no one else could know. He knew what type of tape was used to bind the blindfold around her eyes. He knew what type of sexual assault had taken place. And I'm giving you facts, sir, that were not public.
Detective Sosowski took his evidence to the prosecutors who had already sent Cruz to death row.
What did the prosecutors do with this information?
They resisted it.
So they essentially blew it off.
Yes, sir.
So if they accept your information that Brian Dugan did it, then they have to admit that the people they have put in prison didn't do it.
Put on death row. Didn't do it.
Despite Brian Dugan's confession and the lack of any physical evidence linking Rolando Cruz to the crime, Cruz was tried a second time. He was convicted again, but a higher court threw out that guilty verdict as they did the first one, because they said the jury did not get to hear all the incriminating evidence against Brian Dugan. Still, DuPage County prosecutors decided to put Cruz on trial for a third time, even though new DNA evidence had come to light linking Brian Dugan to the Nicarico murder.
Even after DNA testing proved that Brian Dugan was clearly involved in this crime, even though that was established, they went ahead and tried Rolando Cruz again. That's frightening to me.
It was in the middle of the third trial when a high-ranking police official admitted that he had lied about the evidence against Cruz that the prosecution's case collapsed. The judge immediately stopped the trial, and Rolando Cruz, after spending a decade on death row, was finally free.
It's not that easy. I mean, people tell me, well, you're free now. Free? How? Psychologically, I'm not free from it all.
A year after the conviction of Rolando Cruz was finally thrown out, the legal system was turned upside down when a special grand jury took the unprecedented step of indicting the very people who had built the case against Cruz. 3 prosecutors and 4 police officers were charged with fabricating the case, making up the evidence that had sent Cruz to death row and kept him there for 10 years. According to the indictment, a critical line had been crossed, the line between aggressive prosecution and criminal misconduct. Prosecutor Thomas Knight was arrested and charged with knowing that Cruz's dream statement was fabricated, but presenting it to the jury anyway. And prosecutor Robert Colander was arrested and charged with obstruction of justice for concealing the details of Brian Dugan's confession, which could have freed Cruz from death row years earlier.
I think the main charge should be conspiracy to commit murder, because that's what they did. They conspired when they made that up to commit a murder, to have me executed for something I didn't do.
What troubles many people about this case is that even before Brian Dugan confessed to the Nicarico murder, there was evidence that could have led police to Dugan before he went on to rape and murder two other people, an 8-year-old girl named Melissa Ackerman and 27-year-old nurse Donna Schnorr. Immediately after the Jeanine Nicarico murder, two eyewitnesses told police they saw a fair-skinned man between the ages of 25 and 30 driving away from the murder scene in an old green car with a missing hubcap. That description fit Brian Dugan and the car that he owned. But prosecutors became totally convinced that Rolando Cruz was the killer and dropped that promising lead. Thomas Breen is Rolando Cruz's lawyer.
How would you describe the quality of the police work in the Nicarico case?
Real policemen follow real leads, and they inventory real evidence. They do real investigations. This was a joke.
Now he and Rolando Cruz would get one last chance to prove their innocence. Rolando's third trial began on October 24th, 1995. Where a lone public defender had originally defended Cruz, some of Chicago's finest lawyers defended him for free the third time around. Thomas Breen, Matt Cannelli, and Larry Marshall. The defense attorneys made a key decision early on. They took Rolando's fate out of a jury's hands and requested Judge Ronald Mailing to rule on the case instead. On top of that, the evidence against Cruz was crumbling since his last trial in 1990. Dramatic advances had been made in DNA testing, and just weeks before trial, the premier expert in the country announced his findings.
It excluded conclusively Rolando Cruz, Alejandro Hernandez, and Stephen Buckley. And what this evidence showed, that there was only a 3/100ths of 1% chance, a 3 in 10,000 chance, that what was found in Jeanine Nicarico had come from somebody other than Brian Dugan.
The DNA evidence forced prosecutors to concede that Brian Dugan was involved in Jeanine Nicarico's murder.
Time did in this case, were certain younger men who were amoral or immoral and willing to come to court and lie against somebody were no longer willing to do that 8 years later, 10 years later.
There would be one more witness who would change his testimony. Sheriff's Lieutenant James Montezano had played a small but crucial role in the testimony of DuPage County Sheriff's detectives Dennis Kurzawa and Thomas Vosberg. The detectives claimed to have called Montezano at a suburban Chicago home for advice on the day of the infamous dream statement. During pretrial hearings, Montezano had corroborated the two detectives, but now he wanted to revise his story. And on November 3rd, the court recalled him as a witness.
Rolando and I were absolutely stunned. 12 years. And Rolando Cruz says, oh my God, someone's finally going to tell the truth.
I remember going back, sitting down. I'm writing a note to my mom. I didn't testify.
Montezano said he had checked his credit card receipts. He now realized he had been in Florida on the day of the so-called dream statement. Contrary to his prior testimony, he had never spoken to the detectives.
He finally broke down and admitted that he lied.
Defense attorneys immediately requested the judge to throw out the case for lack of evidence. Judge Ronald Mailing took a 30-minute recess to consider. By the time he returned to the bench, court deputies had rolled out a security barrier, blocking off the spectator gallery. The judge held up Jeanine Nicarico's picture, calling her the most important person in the case. As the judge spoke, defense attorney Breen anticipated the ruling about to occur.
I turned to Rolando and I said, we're going home. And his legs started shaking. And just just up and down, up and down, up and down, and his body began to shake. He began to cry. You could tell it was finally sinking in, and he was saying, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, and finally.
Judge Mailing told the courtroom he could not recall a case in which more witnesses had changed their testimony. He called Lieutenant Montezano's admission that he had lied to the court unique in the annals of criminal justice. Then Mailing found Rolando Cruz not guilty. With the acquittals of Cruz and Hernandez came angry charges of official misconduct. One of the targets was the man who had overseen the Nicarico prosecutions, first as DuPage County State's Attorney, and then as Illinois Attorney General, Jim Ryan.
We relied on judges and juries and the Supreme Court to guide us in this case. We relied on the police investigation, and I relied on the experience of our prosecutors.
A year later, 3 of those prosecutors and 4 other DuPage County officials were indicted on charges they had lied and concealed evidence to convict Cruz, charges that could land them in prison.
There must always be a line between vigorous prosecution and official misconduct, between advocacy and unfairness, between justice and injustice. This indictment charges that line was crossed.
Among those accused of crossing that line were former prosecutors Thomas Knight, Patrick King Jr., and Robert Calander, as well as sheriff's officers Dennis Kurzawa, Thomas Vosberg, and James Montezano.
It took a lot more than 1 or 2 people to stop what I think was a truly evil prosecution from going forward. And I think there's a lesson in that about the way good triumphs over evil.
The fact that DNA evidence indicates Brian Dugan raped Jeanine Nicarico. State's attorneys have never charged Dugan with the crime. Their investigation remains open. Dugan is serving 2 life sentences at the Menard Correctional Facility. The man who spent a decade on death row for a crime Dugan confessed to has been adjusting to a life of freedom. Cruz was 19 years old when he entered prison, 32 years old when he got out.
Days after his acquittal in early November 1995, Rolando Cruz went on a symbolic errand. Now that he was starting life over, he needed a copy of his birth certificate as identification. So Cruz and his attorney Tom Breen headed off to the Kane County Clerk's office to order the birth certificate. But after all his years in prison, Cruz had only one document with his name on it to prove who he really was. And the ultimate irony, it was his signed death warrant, stating that he was to be executed by lethal injection on the 12th of June, 1985. And indeed, Rolando Cruz was a man reborn, after an ordeal the likes of which American justice had never seen. For those who battled so long to free Cruz and Alex Hernandez, the lesson is not necessarily a popular one. While there are certainly cases of wealthy criminals who spend their money to beat the rap, it is often too easy to convict innocent but poor people of murder.
The prosecution was spending, all their resources to get these guys convicted. It was absolutely essential, and they had absolutely no shame. They would put on any piece of evidence.
And according to the defense, would go to any lengths to hide evidence. 1 month before trial, defense attorney Johnson got a tip that a prior expert who examined Buckley's boots, a technician at the DuPage County Crime Lab, had ruled them out as a match. The sheriffs had actually retrieved the boots and instructed the technician not to file a report, a move that led the crime lab director to resign. Prosecutors never told the defense about that initial finding, a violation of Illinois law.
They got caught. We asked the judge to dismiss the case or for some sanction for what they did. The judge did nothing. Did nothing. And so they were able to continually get away with putting on tainted evidence, perjured testimony. I remember at a couple of points getting up and saying to the judge, when is this going to stop?
After deliberating for 2 days, the jury deadlocked on the charges against Buckley. But they found Rolando Cruz and Alex Hernandez guilty. It was February 22nd, 1985, almost 2 years to the day since the murder.
It was such a high-profile case. The need for conviction and the state's desire for conviction was obviously felt by the jury. I really do believe that the jury's attitude in that case was, give us something to hang our hats on and we'll give you the guilty verdict.
Even one juror who had some doubts about the guilt of Rolando Cruz finally gave in to the majority.
I didn't feel that I was going to be the one person that is going to say, I don't think any of them are guilty. I just couldn't do that. You know, you sit for 7 weeks and you look at poor Tom and Pat Nicarico, and you know, that's very tough.
The state planned to retry Stephen Buckley, but prosecutor Thomas Knight wanted a little help from Cruz.
The night before sentencing, they came to DuPage County Jail, asked me to testify against Stephen Buckley, and that they would, quote unquote, beg the judge to give me just natural life, but they couldn't promise. I told him he was stupid. I told him I didn't kill anybody. I wasn't there. I don't know what happened. I wasn't testifying against anybody.
The next day, the judge sentenced Cruz and Hernandez to die by lethal injection. They were transferred to the condemned unit of the Menard Correctional Facility in southern Illinois. Both were 21 years old. Rolando Cruz was once again facing an appointment with the Illinois executioner, but his defense team was determined to vindicate him. They would soon acquire an unlikely ally, one of the prosecutors. With Rolando Cruz facing execution once again for the rape and murder of Jeanine Nicarico, the machinery of American justice took its usual course. The verdict was automatically appealed to the Illinois Supreme Court. When Assistant Attorney General Mary Kenney was assigned to handle the appeal, she had no idea it would mean the end of her career as a prosecutor. Kenney's job was to defeat the death row appeal. But as a prosecutor, she knew she had a responsibility to make sure the defendant, Rolando Cruz, had gotten a fair trial.
My fascination with the criminal justice system has to do with how do we make this process fair? How do we ensure that the worst kind of mistake that there could be, the execution of an innocent man, doesn't happen?
Kenney thought that mistake was being made in the case of Rolando Cruz. She concluded he had not received a fair trial. Kenney believed the jury in the second trial should have been allowed to hear more about Brian Dugan's past crimes. Deeply troubled by her finding, Kenney went to her supervisor, hoping she could convince him to admit a terrible mistake had been made.
One of the responses I got from him is, what are we going to tell the Nicaricos about this? There was a real concern that this victim's family is pushing for an execution, and no one wanted to have to tell them that innocent men had been sentenced to die.
Over Kenney's objections, Illinois Attorney General Roland Burris pressed on to affirm the death sentence. Kenney resigned in protest and made public a letter in which she begged Burris, do not help execute an innocent man.
I loved being a criminal prosecutor. Quitting was difficult. I struggled with that decision, but I knew that I was doing the right thing.
His conviction, forcing DuPage County to put him on trial for yet a third time.
It was only after a request for reconsideration which led to, frankly, an outpouring of support in the form of what we lawyers call amicus curiae briefs from various law school professors, religious leaders, that led the court to agree to reconsider the case.
One of the people who paid close attention to that judgment was the attorney who was preparing to appeal the conviction of Alex Hernandez, Scott Turow. The noted author says that in 18 years of practicing law, he had never seen as many abuses committed by police and prosecutors as he did in the Nicarico case.
You can't take $10,000 and essentially say to somebody, make something up, and then offer it in evidence against them. I mean, that's not the way we do things in this country. But that was what happened to Alex Hernandez.
In January 1995, Thoreau convinced an Illinois appellate court to overturn the conviction of Hernandez. Now he and Rolando Cruz for a third life sentence. Dugan told Sisowski that on February 25th, 1983, he had not shown up to his job at a label printing company. Instead, he got high on marijuana and spent the day driving around Naperville, stopping at an elderly woman's house for help when he had car trouble. A little while later, Dugan pulled up to 620 Clover Court.
He approached the Nicarico house, I believe, to commit a burglary. He told me he could see Jeanine through a window in the front door. He spoke to her and said, "Can I borrow a screwdriver?" She said, "No." And he said, "Can I use your telephone?" And she said, "I can't let you use my telephone." He then said to me, "I knew she was alone."
Dugan said he kicked in the front door and chased Jeanine upstairs. He wrapped her in a bedsheet and blindfolded her with a towel. Dugan then drove Jeanine to the nature trail, where he said he raped her, hit her over the head with a tire iron, and fled.
I wasn't sure whether he was manipulating the system. He told me that he wanted to clear 3 people who were unjustly charged with the Nicarico homicide.
By the time the police commander finished his investigation 1 month later, he found the evidence overwhelming that Dugan had killed Jeanine by himself. Timesheets confirmed Dugan had not shown up for work on February 25th, the day of Jeanine's abduction. An eyewitness from the church just down the road from the Nicaricos placed Dugan in the neighborhood. She had taken down his name when he stopped by around 1 p.m. to ask about a job. And tollway workers had seen a single white male driving a dark green sedan on the nature trail the day of the murder. Dugan's car matched the description, right down to the missing hubcap. Dugan passed a lie detector test, then repeated the same story under hypnosis. Experience told Commander Sisowski a lone offender like Dugan typically committed sex crimes, and he could never find anyone who linked Dugan to Rolando Cruz.
Brian Dugan committed this crime. He committed it alone. He committed it by himself, just as he committed Schnorr, just as he committed Ackerman. He did this crime by himself.
Dugan's murders of Donna Schnorr and Melissa Ackerman showed striking similarities to Jeanine Nicarico's. Dugan had taken those victims to remote, natural settings where he sodomized and then killed them.
Thomas Breen is Rolando Cruz's lawyer.
How would you describe the quality of the police work in the Nicarico case?
Real policemen follow real leads, and they inventory real evidence. They do real investigations. This was a joke.
A joke, Breen says, because Brian Dugan was never questioned, even though he was right under the noses of the police the whole time. Dugan had been arrested in the DuPage County area 27 times for burglaries and assaults on women. And he was even in custody in the county jail for another crime in the midst of the Nicarico investigation.
This makes no sense. He should have never been free. Never been free to kill Donna.
Karen Schweitzer and Roger Schnorr are the sister and brother of Dugan murder victim Donna Schnorr.
So I guess in your eyes, the police, the prosecutors bear some responsibility for
Definitely.
what happened
Those
to Donna.
that were in power, yes.
No doubt.
Yes. There was pressure to find the murderer or murderers of Jeanine, and therefore I think they found 3 people, and it was to further their own careers that they find someone to pin it on and ignore the real killer, who then was free to do what he wanted, which was kill Donna.
What would you say to the family of Donna Schnorr, who said that if the police had done their job, if you had done your job properly, she would still be alive?
The police worked countless hours, uncompensated hours. The police, the prosecutors, everybody who was involved in this case, doing their level best to find the people who committed this crime,
To this day, despite his confession and DNA testing that shows his semen matches the semen found in the body of Jeanine Nicarico, Brian Dugan has not been charged with the murder.
To charge Brian Dugan, this system has to admit it made a mistake. For them to admit that mistake, they also have to admit exactly what they're accused of, which is presenting perjured, fabricated, phony evidence to convict an innocent man.
Has this case taught you anything about the criminal justice system that you didn't know?
The terrible mix of prosecution and politics that can result, and the fact that if you take a heinous and inflammatory crime and misbehavior by prosecutors, you can convict innocent people and have them sentenced to death.
Sisowski submitted his report to the DuPage County State's Attorney's Office in December 1985. It was not welcomed.
It was, for whatever reason, argued, resented, and unaccepted.
If they accept this confession from Brian Dugan, they got some explaining to do. They have got to go back and tell people how it was that they convicted and put on death row two innocent guys.
By now, the DuPage County State's Attorney was Jim Ryan, who had defeated Michael Fitzsimmons in 1984.
We always examined the evidence at every juncture and re-examined it with every new development.
Prosecutors pointed out several inconsistencies in Dugan's story. He had failed to remember a 12-foot sailboat parked in the Nicarico's driveway. He had been mistaken about Jeanine's toenail polish. And he could not lead police to the house where he claimed to have stopped when he had car trouble.
The inconsistencies didn't bother me at all. We're talking about a crime that he committed, again, 33 months before I talked to him. He made mistakes, but he never changed his story.
The Nicaricos disagreed. They had gone over details with Sisowski several times during his investigation. They accused Sisowski of feeding Dugan information.
And if indeed he was consciously fed by somebody, that to me is horrendous, it's frightening, and it's worse than the crime of our daughter being killed.
The Illinois Attorney General's office now placed Sisowski himself under investigation for his handling of the case.
And I just said to my wife, I said, that's it. Ain't worth it. I'm not going to fight the system anymore. And she said, well, if you don't fight for Cruz and Hernandez, who is? I said, okay, we'll go through this one more time.
But Ed Sisowski did not know that DuPage County prosecutors had already heard Dugan's statement 3 days before Sisowski ever had. They had written notes on what exactly Dugan did know about the crime. They never told Sisowski or turned over their notes, which might have shed new light on the case and cleared Sisowski of the charge that he had fed Dugan information.
Tonight's special segment, the story of an alleged jailhouse plot to assassinate one-time death row inmate Rolando Cruz. The ABC 7i team has interviewed a Chicago street gang leader who claims he was recruited by several DuPage County officials. At the time, Cruz was in the DuPage County Jail being retried for the murder and kidnapping of Jeanine Nicarico, a 10-year-old Naperville girl. Cruz was acquitted. Tonight, the exclusive story of an alleged murder plot against Cruz from ABC 7 investigative reporter Chuck Gowdy.
At the time this videotape was made of murder convict Rolando Cruz, a plan had been hatched to kill Cruz in a jailhouse hit. So says this man, Antonio Asensio, then a ranking member of the Latin King street gang, a burglar and an auto thief. In 1995, Asensio himself was in this downstate Illinois prison. He claims that in September of '95, several DuPage County Sheriff's deputies showed up here for a visit to draft him as the assassin.
They started explaining to me that Rolando Cruz was causing too many problems for everyone, and that they wanted to solve that problem. And they told me that if I could do them a favor, they will make sure that I will get released, early release. And I asked them what was the favor, and they told me that they wanted Rolando Cruz killed.
And so when you left that meeting, what was your understanding as to what was going to happen? Now, what they wanted you to do?
Basically, I knew what they wanted me to do. They wanted me to kill Rolando Cruz.
They tell you how they wanted you to do it?
No. They just told me that they would be more specific. They would explain to me more once I got to DuPage.
I had heard that, that some harm might come to Rolando Cruz.
Carlos Rodriguez was a DuPage deputy sheriff at the time, working as a gang specialist inside the county jail. Rodriguez claims someone engineered Ascensio's transfer from Menard to the DuPage County jail, allegedly to testify in a case, but actually to carry out the hit.
When I went into Asensio's cell, I told him I knew why he was here. I had heard the rumors, and I had heard that, that some harm might come to Rolando Cruz, and I told him that as a gang intelligence officer and a sworn deputy sheriff, I couldn't allow that to happen. Asensio then told me he had to follow his orders, that he didn't want to be at the DuPage County Jail. Just like me, he has to follow orders.
As it turned out, Rolando Cruz's trial had ended abruptly, weeks earlier than expected, with a directed verdict of acquittal, and he had been released. But even though Cruz was freed before Asensio ever arrived in DuPage County, Asensio says that same sheriff's deputy came to his cell. He says this time with an assistant DuPage state's attorney.
They wanted Cruz dead because of the problems he was going to cause, about him bring him out in the open about all the corruption that they did on this case, all the false evidence they planted on him. So they wanted me to send the word through the jail into the street that they wanted Cruz assassinated. And they told me they wanted me to kill Cruz, that they'll find a way so I won't get investigated or I won't get charged with it. Because they said that Cruz was going to cause them more problems than what he has already.
Nevertheless, Rodriguez, a one-time U.S. Marine and specially trained street gang investigator, says he was convinced the gang would carry out the Cruz hit on the outside, and so he planned a secret jailhouse meeting to stop the scheme.
I told Asensio that in a couple of days that I would get some of these inmates that he needed to talk to send the word out to stop any hit on Cruz or any gang violence whatsoever in the DuPage County Jail, that I would get them together and I would be there personally so he could give them this information. But I told him that I would be there.
A month later, Rodriguez himself was fired for facilitating communication between known gang members. In this court petition for a rehearing filed last week, Rodriguez contends he should have his job back because there was a hit on Rolando Cruz and that he had attempted to stop the threatened. Tonight, a DuPage County Sheriff's spokeswoman says, quote, "The department is absolutely denying this, and it is absolutely ridiculous," unquote. Also tonight, DuPage County State's Attorney Joe Burkett tells the I-Team, quote, "These allegations have been looked into and were found to be totally without merit," unquote. And Burkett maintains that Asensio is a liar. Chuck Gowdy, ABC 7 News.
Asensio has never been questioned by DuPage County investigators about this alleged plot, but again, the allegations did come up during the firing of former Deputy Carlos Rodriguez.
Today, about 2.5 days before my term ends as governor, I stand before you to explain my frustrations and deep concerns about both the administration and the penalty of death.
It didn't have to happen. It was just sheer serendipity that it had happened.
People were taking credit for the grassroots effort that started on death row.
I supported it in my entire career.
In January 2003, then Governor of Illinois George Ryan granted clemency to all those on death row in light of stark evidence showing the state had sentenced innocent men to their deaths for decades, a decision that would lead to a national movement.
Out of 25, there were 12 exonerations and 13 executions. It's like flipping a coin. Who's going to live and who's going to die?
You know, the death penalty has been controversial for a long period of time. It's been controversial basically since the founding of our republic.
Because the system's neither bad or good, it's just words on paper.
Well, when I came into office in January of 1999, I was a strong advocate of the death penalty.
But the death penalty wasn't even on the governor's radar until he saw a story about a man come within 48 hours of execution, only to be found innocent.
And I saw where this fellow by the name of Anthony Porter had been released from prison after spending 15 or 18 years on death row, and then they determined that he was innocent. And I turned to my wife and I said, how does that happen in America?
I think it was just a human reaction of George Ryan, as he was fond of saying, I'm just a pharmacist from Kankakee. I'm not a lawyer. I don't understand. This is horrifying to me. This is horrible. I didn't realize how bad it was. It was just a basic human response.
So I looked at that whole situation and said, something's not right here. And that's when I came to the fact that we had to either abolish the death penalty or stop the executions and study the situation to see if the law could be fixed or if it could be made better.
The following year, Ryan put a moratorium on the death penalty in order for a commission to investigate cases like Anthony Porter and the 20 others who would be exonerated. But their findings would be completely ignored.
I couldn't pass any part of 85 recommendations to improve the system because it was an election year, and I don't know if I could have done it in a non-election year, but I know I sure could have in an election year. Politics plays a big role in it. People don't want to look like they're soft on crime, and they vote accordingly. But generally my whole staff said it was the wrong thing to do, but their concern was more political. The system didn't work, and I had an obligation as governor. I was the last check on a system that was supposed to work.
By the time Governor Ryan commuted all the death sentences, we had, I think, 13 people who had been exonerated and released. That number ultimately grew to 20. And that was out of a total of 303 people in this state who had been sentenced to death. We have 20 who were released in the face of substantial claims of actual innocence.
February 24th of '83, Jeanine Nicarico was kidnapped, raped, and murdered.
Rolando Cruz had been sentenced to death for the rape and murder of a girl in 1983.
Rolando had become a suspect when this little girl, Jeanine Nicarico from Naperville, Illinois, had been abducted, raped, and murdered.
Well, I think that's a classic case of abuse.
They could not find who did it. Fitzsimmons, who was then the state attorney, he turned around and tried to find who did it. He was called out to the public. He offered a $10,000 reward.
Whatever evidence there was against them, and there was none, really, had existed from the very beginning.
They arrested me on August 1st, 1983. When I got indicted, I was 20 years old, 2 months and 5 days.
And yet they weren't indicted until the eve of an election.
It was stupid. And I hate saying it because it was then, and it, believe it or not, it still is to me. It was comical, you know. I mean, you know, I was a smart-ass street punk, you know. I mean, it's just reality. You can't charge somebody for something they didn't do.
J. Michael Fitzsimmons was being challenged by a man named Jim Ryan, and literally on the eve of the primary, Fitzsimmons, in a desperate effort to win re-election, indicts Rolando Cruz.
It became real the day I walked in for the first day of trial. And they called me in, and we went to the courtroom, and they said, oh, we have a new piece of evidence we have to hand over against Mr. Cruz.
A so-called vision statement that the authorities had attributed to Rolando Cruz. He denied making it, in which he had been part of a murder similar to this.
But we have no notes. We have no police reports. We have no taped statements. We have no proof. But he said this 17 and a half months ago.
Well, it turned out that the authorities had fabricated that. The prosecutors in that case just ignored complete logic.
But I knew at that point, you know, as I told my mother when we were waiting for the verdict, I told her, well, I know they're going to convict me.
If Ryan had done the right thing, he could have been a hero, and he would have been a hero of this movement, but he didn't. He did the wrong thing. He decided to proceed with the prosecution of these 3 innocent kids and put 2 of them on death row.
I went to death row down in Menard, Illinois, well, Chester, Illinois, down in Menard Correctional Center. And I started trying to figure out what to do And I would go to the library, the law library, and I would look at books, but I had no clue what I was looking at. One of my main mentors was Dickie Gaines, and he's a death row inmate. And he says, I'm gonna teach you the law. And we started learning the law, and I mean, where it was points where it was 72 hours straight, even longer, without sleeping, just pounding it, trying to learn.
It would take 12 years of tireless effort, 2 trials, 1 appeal, resignations of state officials, and finally, a 3rd trial, one that would see the criminal informant recant his testimony, and the admission of a police officer who had been lying for 12 years for the truth to finally come out.
When Lieutenant James Bonasano was given the evidence in front of his face, he broke down and acknowledged that he lied, intentionally, willingly, and knowingly. And the judge said he'll take in consideration, and he called for recess, for a 20-minute recess, I believe it was. And I went down into the subblock. Then they called me over the PA system, said that I had to go because it was time to go back to court. And then they had the biggest bailiff I've ever seen standing right there with 2-way chains, which they never put on me in the courtroom. He put the safety box over the handcuffs, and he put 50,000 volts of electricity around my waist. And then he showed me the trigger mechanism in his hand and said that if I did anything at all, that he would push it. And at that second, my world just spun away because I didn't know what the hell was going on now. Him and another bailiff told me, you're gonna see something in this courtroom, and it's for your protection. So don't get scared. And they opened it, and they had the bulletproof partition, which they never had. And it was wall-to-wall DuPage County cops in there, which they never had. It was always just the 2 elderly bailiffs. And then the Honorable Ronald Mayling came in the courtroom, and he looked, he didn't even sit down. And he said, I don't know what the hell all this is in my courtroom, but you get it out. He goes, you get it out. I was looking up, and I was thinking, God. Next thing I know, because they didn't let me be in there, they didn't let me hear the judge release me. And they had me in the hallway, and he says, well, are you gonna laugh? You're gonna cry? What are you gonna do? And I just looked at him, and I just, he just got to torture me psychologically with all this garbage they put on me. It was 4,473 days.
Rolando Cruz didn't know it then, but he was a free man for the first time in 12 years.
And I walked out, I don't know what it felt. Feeling so many different things, so fast, so quick. First time I got to hug my mother, with no chains, nobody around, nobody.
He was released in 1995, 4 years before Governor Ryan would take office. But his case attracted national attention, and he would work to shape the governor's policy.
I jumped out there, and I stayed in the media's face. It was a lot of hard work.
On January 11th, 2003, Governor Ryan declared clemency for all death sentences in Illinois. In 2011, his successor abolished the death penalty in the state.
We have abolished the death penalty in Illinois.
As for the rest of the country,
we certainly created, I think, an atmosphere for discussion that was never there during my early days in government and public service and in my life, frankly, to at least question the system.
I'm a firm supporter of the death penalty. I believe if you take an innocent life, you forfeit your life.
I feel good that I was able maybe to start the movement to abolish the death penalty in some of the other states.
It occurred to me long ago that what we really need to do is figure out a way to prevent these wrongful convictions from occurring, because we're never going to be able to correct them all after the fact.
In a perfect society, we would never have anybody wrongfully convicted. And we are not a perfect society. So we cannot have the implementation of the death penalty as it stands now.
La première fois